to welcome you. Sorry, that was the recording in progress announcement. Good afternoon. I am honored to welcome you to a talk that we are really enthusiastically anticipating. It's called You Have Friends in High Places, about NIH resources for women in biomedical careers. And it is featuring Dr. Janine Austin Clayton, MD, FARVO. This event is part of our series that is called Amplifying Equity. It features esteemed colleagues from many other environments as well as our own. And these are all people who've been involved in advancing gender equity, both at Sinai and beyond, as I said. It's sponsored by the Office of Gender Equity in Science and Medicine, and we're very excited that today continues highlighting an individual who has been making major strides in this area and will share with us some of the lessons she's learned. So let me introduce myself. I am Sandy Mazur, and I'm professor of ophthalmology and pharmacological sciences, and I'm also the director of the Office for Women's Careers within the Office of Gender Equity in Science and Medicine. So thank you so much for spending your lunch with us, and please do introduce yourself in the chat and use the chat feature to present questions for Dr. Clayton as they arise, and we'll ask them and answer them hopefully during the question and answer session at the end of her talk. The talk will go for about 45 minutes, and then we will have 10 to 15 minutes for questions. So it is my sincere pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Janine Austin Clayton. She's director of the Office for Research of Women's Health at the NIH. And in that position, she has strengthened the NIH's support for research on diseases, disorders, and conditions that affect women. Dr. Clayton is also the architect of the NIH policy requiring scientists to consider sex as a biological variable across the research spectrum, a part of the NIH's initiative to enhance reproducibility, rigor, and transparency in research. Equally important to us, she leads NIH's efforts to advance women in science, and she does this as co-chair of the NIH Working Group on Women in Biomedical Careers, where she serves as co-chief with the NIH director. Dr. Clayton is a board-certified ophthalmologist and was previously the deputy clinical director of the National Eye Institute, which is how I was lucky enough to first meet her, because my research was funded through the NEI, and I got a lot of wisdom from interacting with her. So it was great to have her in the NEI, even better now to have her in the Office for Research in Women's Health. Her own research interests include autoimmune ocular diseases, the role of sex and gender in health and disease, and she's authored more than 120 scientific publications. She's received awards that are really too numerous to list, but the one I want to highlight is the Bernadine Healy Award for Visionary Leadership in Women's Health, which was named for the first woman to lead the NIH. So thank you so much for being with us today, Janine. We are really looking forward to having your talk and to the subsequent discussion. And I now turn the stage over to Dr. Clayton.
Thank you, Sandy. It's great to be here. I'm going to share my screen, and that was a really kind introduction. Let's get that up. Okay, we've got the right view. Devin, give me a thumbs up if we're good to go. Great, thank you so much. So it's my pleasure to be here and to talk to you today. And I will confess that this title was created by one of my colleagues in the office, and I said, oh, wow, that's kind of a little self-congratulatory there. But I decided to keep it because somebody else said it. So I'm delighted to be here to share my thoughts with you and to give you a little bit of information about the programs at NIH. I've heard this saying, I'm sure you've heard it. It's said that every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets, because that's how it's designed. So we have a system. Let's talk about the system we have, and then let's talk about the system we want. So here's the system we have. You all know this data very well. This is AAMC data, and the far left, you can see medical school applicants are over 50% female. But as we progress through the professoriate, you can see that drastically dwindles down to 18% of deans or department chairs are women. And this is not too long ago. This is a 2019 report. So nothing new. And despite the fact that women have been, for example, getting over half of the life sciences PhDs for 20 years, we don't see these numbers changing over time. And if you look at women of color are subject to what I call a double whammy and are underrepresented at every level with very little improvement over the last decade. First of all, this is great that the WMC disaggregates this data by sex, gender, race, and ethnicity, so you can actually see the data, even when they are very small, like 0.1% Native American or Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islanders. I applaud them for disaggregating the data in this way, but the data have not really changed, and they are represent severe underrepresentation, I would say. We also know that there are gender gaps in salaries, and I don't have to mention that to this group because you know it well. I do want to share with you that we are publishing for the first time at NIH much more data about our workforce. And this is data from our most recent biennial report. This is the NIH Workforce, entire NIH Workforce, female in the dark orange on the right and male in the dark blue, and the green is unknown. Unreported. And then if you look at race ethnicity, you can see slightly over half are white, 54%, 20% Black, 19% Asian, 3.9% Hispanic, and 1% or less of the other categories, including multi-race category. So starting to get this data out, I think, is really important. Here's more data on this, and I'm not asking you to read the actual data because it's too small on a slide probably. What I highlight for you, though, on the panel on the left is we reported data from our extramural employees, intramural employees, and then other categories. We looked at scientific occupations, female, which is a dark blue, flush left, and then the next category is scientific occupations, male, and then infrastructure occupations, female and male. And I want to highlight just one piece of information. If you look at extramural, far left, you can see that the highest bar is the blue bar. That's scientific occupations, female, more than male in our extramural. But if you look at intramural, you see a more typical pattern that you would see in academia, which is more more male scientific occupations. And of course, you see the exact opposite pattern in the infrastructure, right? So nothing new here. But it's important for us to get this information out and to say, honestly, NIH has the same challenges and patterns that we see in academia. And on the right, what I highlight there is extramural at the top, intramural in the middle, and other in the bottom. And then for each race, ethnicity category, we have the data for both sexes. So we have sex, gender by race, ethnicity data here. And that's what's so important, is to get this disaggregated information out. Some of my colleagues just recently emailed me and said, I've never seen this data disaggregated this way, and we really appreciate having it out there. So in terms of what we see in more typically reported information, we know, for example, men receive consistently more R01 equivalent grants than women do. RPGs on that far left, it's going up a little bit. That's not really a substantial difference. If you look at centers, the numbers actually went up the most for center grants, and that's good because that's important for the proportion of women. This is women, percentage of women here, to increase for centers, those larger grants. Others in the middle, career awards, K awardees, you can see over half of the K awards and career awards are going to women, right? So an SBIR, STTR are business grants, and not a lot of change there, just kind of bouncing up and down. Now, when women do apply for RPGs, they are just as likely to receive them as men are. In some cases, they receive more funding because they ask for more funding. It depends on the particular RPG. But what we see is women don't come in as often for a second, and they don't, as many women who are eligible to apply don't apply. And so that's an issue clearly. Everyone here has heard about this being a pipeline issue. And I just, did a podcast this morning with the King's Fund in the UK. And I said, this is not a pipeline issue. Women are just not dripping out of the pipeline passively. This is a system issue. and that needs to be addressed with system solutions. So you have women coming into the pipeline with the bachelor's in that bottom left graph and tapering off, as I mentioned. If the top right, you see the parity in medical school, but at the hospital CEO level, medical school data department chair. I also like to report the proportion of women who are, publishers or journal editors. These are all single digits. And of course, our workforce doesn't reflect the occupation. And the reason why that's so important, beyond equity, beyond the diversity dividend, knowing we get better products and better, more creative solutions when we have diverse teams, it also affects our priorities. It affects what we choose to study. It affects what FOA's funding opportunity announcement we put out. It affects what conferences happen. It affects everything. So until we have that diverse workforce, we are not having our best results across the board. So I say it's not a pipeline, it's more like chutes and ladders. Some of us have ladders that we can take advantage of. We know people to call who can help us navigate a system. We have mentors or sponsors. Some of us are more subject to chutes. You're just walking along and all of a sudden you fall through the chute like you stepped in a manhole. And you don't know. You don't have anybody in your family who is a scientist. You just don't know what to do. You don't know how to fill out the form. You don't know what you should be asking for. So it's really more like chutes and ladders, in my opinion, than a pipeline. And I like to include this slide in my talks because I always like to give homage to those that came before. This is from a 1976 meeting that Shirley Malka, who's at the AAAS, and her colleagues, where she put forward her landmark report called The Double Bind, The Price of Being a Minority Woman in Science. And this is what she said. I copied this directly from the report. It's verbatim from the report. And she talks about the fact that programs for minorities and women have generally been assumed to include minority women, but in fact, underrepresented racial and ethnic minority groups, and I really prefer not to use that term minority, but she used it, so I'm going to use it here, fall in the cracks between the two. So women's programs are focused on women, diversity programs are racial and ethnic groups, but nobody's talking about that intersection, women of color in particular, and so they get lost in the shuffle sometimes. This is Joan Williams' work, and she put forward these 4 different patterns of gender bias on the left. Prove it again bias, where women have to work twice as hard. She uses the double bind in a slightly different way. She uses it as women must choose between being liked and being respected. So you could either be a B or a W word, or you could be a nice person that people like. Those schemas around that are important to consider. The maternal wall, when mothers are assumed to either be incompetent or uncommitted. Oh, she doesn't want to do this. We're not even going to offer to her. She has a kid. And gender wars, where women are pitted against each other and there are conflicts in the workplace. So she puts forward these 4 patterns of gender bias. She also says that women of color, in particular Black women and Latinas, also have racial and ethnic bias on top of these 4. So the experience of women of color differs from both men of color, who may be subject to racial discrimination, but also we have the sexism, and then we have the intersection, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more. Women of color also reported that they had to confront negative racial stereotypes, like the angry Black woman, and Black women were more likely than other women to report a profound sense of isolation, and this is from an NSF grant. Latinas and Black women were often reported, and this continues, being mistaken for janitors, and men of color experience similar things. So this term called intersectionality was originally coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and she and others picked it up subsequently, and she describes it as a way to understand the individualized and collective effects of inequality. And she uses it as, quote, a lens, a prism for seeing the way in which various forms of inequality often operate together and exacerbate each other. We tend to talk about race and inequality as separate from inequality based on gender, class, sexuality, or immigrant status. What often is missing is how some people are subject to all of these, and that the experience is not just the sum of its parts. I will say, I was speaking at an effort around diversity, and somebody asked me, had I experienced more racism or sexism? And I said, when people do stuff to me, I really don't know why they're doing it to me. It still hurts. I don't know what they're thinking. It doesn't matter. It's still wrong and it hurts. So it was kind of a weird question, but I will just share that was my response to that. So we see, of course, this is from the National Academy's report on addressing sexual harassment. And of course, sexual harassment, overt coercion, or assault are at the very top of this iceberg. And there's a lot beneath that. This report is outstanding. It talks about the fact that the hustle culture that we have in academia encourages work-life blurring and ideal worker norms. This is pre-COVID. So now with COVID, I mean, what is work-life separation? I mean, you're working, everything is being disrupted. I'll talk about that. The cultural stereotypes that undermine views of women as leaders, you know, those agentic characteristics that are glorified in science, and then women of color facing these higher workplace discrimination rates and also work-family conflict. So we have to take into consideration the different contexts. And of course, they outlined issues related to sexual harassment there, and gender harassment being part of their definition of sexual harassment. Women in science cope with a hostile work environment, as you all know, and it reflects broader society. And I'm very concerned about the pandemic's disproportionate negative impact on women and the loss of productivity and the risk of losing hard-fought gains in gender equity. So at this point, I think we need to redouble our efforts and be constantly vigilant to eliminate workplace bias and develop methods to address implicit and explicit bias, and address equities that we see in salaries, resources, space, and opportunities for advancement. And this also came at a time where the murder of George Floyd and others brought a lot of attention on this national reckoning on racial equity and justice that increased the visibility of women of color in science who encounter an even greater set of challenges and obstacles at the confluence of racial and gender discrimination. And so here's the consensus study report, NIH supported effort, and talked about how pervasive, how destructive, and how demoralizing sexual harassment is in STEM. Over half of female faculty and staff reported, 20 to 50% of female students reported in these areas. They compared it to some other areas like humanities, it's greater in science. Female medical students were 220% more likely than students from other backgrounds to have faced sexual harassment from faculty or staff. That number is just astounding, disturbing, and wrong. It's just unbelievable. And of course, women who are lesbian or bisexual or endorse gender egalitarian beliefs and are stereotypically masculine, this is their characterization, have higher rates as well. So lots of work to be done here, and the National Academies brought attention to these issues, and I'll talk a little bit later about some of the steps that we're taking to work on them. So all of us in the world were subject to this pandemic 2 years ago, and the burden, first of all, the women who are in the front lines, providing the caregiving, providing the healthcare, with 70% of healthcare workers being women, deserve all the applause and support we could possibly give them. In terms of women in the labor workforce, we see changes there and particular concerns for women in STEM. But I always like to intersperse some science data or clinical data in any talk that I give, even these career talks like this. And this is data from Georgia and Michigan, sex and race ethnicity disaggregated data on COVID, age-adjusted COVID mortality rates, okay? So when you think about COVID, we know that the cases, the infections, depending on what data you look at, slightly higher in women than in men, and that's been said because of exposure. This is early in the pandemic when a lot of healthcare workers were exposed, but the mortality rate is higher in men than women. That has continued to be recognized, and maybe the sex differences there will continue to spur us on to be able to understand that better. But if you did, so more men are dying than women, right? So if you look at sex, gender, by race, ethnicity, what you see here is that Black women's COVID-19 rates in Michigan were 4 times greater than those of white men and 3 times greater than Asian men's, and the same pattern was seen in Georgia. So again, if you don't disaggregate this data by sex, gender, and race, ethnicity, and of course also by age, you aren't going to really be understanding what's going on. And of course, the social factors were interacting with biologic factors like sex, so gender factors, and race, which is a social construct, of course, you know, to generate these inequalities. So just another reminder to look at that. It's been, this is last year data, and so tough year for women's careers. I kept the slide in because I just wanted to highlight the fact that different disciplines have experienced different things. So women who are in disciplines that require you being in the laboratory at the bench have resulted in fewer work hours, research hours, and those are in the bright orange there on the right. Health sciences disciplines have had more hours because a lot of people have been called in to do clinical work that were maybe doing it at a lower frequency. And computer scientists, economists, mathematics, statisticians have really seen no change. I mean, they could do a lot of their work completely virtually. But I saved this quote because it really hit me hard, and I keep it in because it's reminding me of what I need to find a way to help with. This individual says, it's sort of like you're drowning and the university tells you, don't worry, if it takes you an extra year to get back to the shore, it's like, hey, that's not helpful. I need a flotation device. Like and I thought about tenure extensions and things like that. So on their face, they look like good things and they can be helpful, but in and of themselves are not sufficient to do what we need to do to advance equity. So we've certainly seen greater loss of research time for women who are mothers, and women with the youngest children, men too, with the youngest children, have the greatest time of the research loss, but it's more for women, of course, than men. Some of the suggestions we got from the stakeholders were removing the stigma of caregiving, altering the evaluation criteria, prioritizing submissions from what they called there was vulnerable groups, and making virtual conferences free. So just some of the early papers that helped us really understand right away that this was going to be a pandemic that had differential impacts on women and men. And even the McKinsey Group and the New York Times got into it. And this is well recognized. And then I would tell you, I mean, of course, women of color were already facing more gaps before the pandemic. So it's not surprising that they are now facing more challenges as well. And so women are leaving the workforce. You've heard about the Great Resignation, that's women and men. But in terms of the labor force, this is of real concern to us all. I keep this slide in to highlight the difference between equality and equity. So equality is clear, giving everybody the same thing. Equity refers to providing what people need to participate. And in this case, it's just a very straightforward model. And we need to provide equitable working environments to make sure that everyone can participate so that we can all actually benefit from the brilliance of our collective wisdom, and everyone can reach their full potential and thrive. So we supported a promising practices report at the National Academies more recently, and they challenged everyone to adopt this diversity, inclusion, equity framework to require that they thought was required sustained and intentional institutional commitment. Their components are data-driven accountability, committed leadership, tangible rewards, resources, and recognition. And these were needed to change the system that we've created, which includes climate, culture, and norms. And those are things that are not written, not evident. They're kind of this unwritten playbook that if you don't know, you won't be able to navigate successfully. So now I'm going to shift gears to tell you some of the things that we're doing at the NIH Office of Research on Women's Health, or ORWH, to try to get us to the system that we want. So very high level view of some of the programs, not everything's here, just high level. The office's first effort when Dr. Vivian Pinn was the first full-time director of the office was a reentry supplement to provide an on-ramp to people that had left research for a variety of reasons and wanted to return. And I'm pleased to tell you, we reissued that as a reentry and reintegration supplement. The intention being reintegration is a specific path for people that experience an unsafe work environment, broadly defined, including an environment where they are subject to sexual harassment. This gives them an opportunity to move from one place to another. They do not need to leave science. They don't have to re-enter. They can reintegrate in another location. It could even be in the same university in a different lab. So now we have provided the first ever opportunity for NIH funding for people to be able to take advantage of a variety of situations in which they find themselves that are unsafe through no fault of their own. Our Birch program is designed to increase the cadre of women and men women and men who are women's health researchers. I'll show you some data on that later. Our SCORE is NIH's only sex differences center program. The National Academies Beyond Bias and Barriers report came out in 2006. And as a result of that, NIH created the Working Group on Women in Biomedical Careers. And that group issued NIH's first ever funding opportunity announcement that specifically focused on what are the factors that are affecting women in science and what interventions, test interventions that may be able to help them. So that was NIH's first ever RFA on that topic, and that was 2008. We worked on a variety of family-friendly policies across the agency with a lot of different partners. We definitely can't take credit for all of that, but for example, something that ORWH did, which it will be kind of like invisible to you, is we provided the funding for the coding support to create a leave bank at NIH, so that, you know, when we don't use our leave, leave is money and the leave is lost. But there wasn't a system for us to be able to share leave across NIH. Like if I have 200 hours of leave I didn't use, I can't give it to somebody. There was no system for that. So we supported the infrastructure, the IT infrastructure to create that in the first place. Once our money was there, other people also supported it. So we try to be catalytic in that way. We have a small budget, but we try to make it work really hard. We created the Women of Color Research Network. Initially, it was an online NIH.gov webpage, and we still have a small presence there, but we moved it to LinkedIn and have received awards for that. And it's a space for women of color and anyone supporting women of color to share information and advance women in STEM. Then the Francis Collins created a working group on changing the culture to end sexual harassment in 2019. That working group created a report. Francis accepted the entire report in toto, and those recommendations have been implemented. And the reintegration, reentry and reintegration FOA that I mentioned is one of the ways that we're addressing that. And then ORWH was pleased to lead that. Then the Promising Practices report came out in 2020. I mentioned that already, and Marsha McNutt came and spoke about that at NIH, and it's great to have their support at bringing attention to these issues. And then in 2020, we created a challenge, which is a prize that awards institutions who've advanced gender equity and gender diversity in a specific way, with the goal being giving them recognition, but also sharing that information so that others can replicate it as appropriate. So here's our Birch program. It's designed to connect junior faculty with senior faculty, women's health research, and sex and gender differences. We've funded over 700 scholars to date. So here's one example I want to make sure you're aware of. We also create e-learning courses that are all free. One is a bench to bedside course, integrating sex and gender to improve human health. So it highlights in cardiology, immunology, mental health, what are the sex and gender differences? It has little quizzes along the way. It has continuing education credits. And then when the SABV policy came out, so the policy states that we require that investigators working with vertebrate animals and humans account for sex as a biological variable in 3 places: their research design, analysis, and reporting. And so we have a primer on how to do that and an introductory level course as well. So here's some of the data from our Birch. It's a mentored career development, institutional career development award. And of those 750 scholars in this evaluation we did about a year ago, 34% achieved tenure. Over half of them achieved leadership positions defined as dean, associate provost, director, professor, or associate professor. So it's a broad definition. 23% achieved both tenure and a leadership position. And we partnered with HBCUs and minority serving institutions. Because of our partnership, which was very intentional, we were able to increase the proportion of underrepresented racial and ethnic minority groups in our Birch Scholar cohorts from 3% in an earlier cohort to 21% in a more recent cohort. Of course, we do have some data that are, some folks do not provide this information. 75% or so of our scholars are women. And so here's some of our women of color related activities of the working group. I mentioned the RFA, extremely successful. Over 100 papers from that RFA, a grassroots research partnership grew out of it. Those folks have gotten subsequent funding from a variety of funders and doing great things. But that scholarship that created has enabled me to be able to have that data to use at NIH to say, here, we funded this, here's the result. We need to develop some sort of program or pathway for this to be disseminated. So that data was sorely needed and has served as ammunition for some of the other programs that I've talked about. We have a couple of regional chapters of our Women of Color Research Network, And the website is womeninscience.nih.gov, and the information is here. So here's our challenge prize. This is the first prize that NIH has ever released like this. And it came out of the working group on women in biomedical careers. It's designed to recognize institutions who've done a good job in gender diversity with sustained improvement and have developed institutional approaches. So not just one-offs, but things that will change. And the winning institutions presented their work last year, sharing lessons learned, and we are working on developing a toolkit so that that information can be more widely available in a interactive way, so that eventually you could go into this toolkit and say, I'm at a school without a medical school, public university, this number of people, this is my concern, and identify information that'd be most useful to you. So we're working towards that. And here are the award-winning institutions. So we're excited to congratulate them all. And then last year, Dr. Collins took the unprecedented step of creating an initiative at NIH to address structural racism. You know, he said that the events of that year brought into sharp relief the ongoing reality of racial injustice in our country and the responsibility all of us have to address the issue, and created the Unite initiative. Here's some data that are relevant to our conversation today about the significant underrepresentation of African Americans as physicians, about 5% in comparison to the 13% we represent in the US population, and then 56% of physicians are white. So there are other data that I'm not showing here. It's just to demonstrate the underrepresentation. And I do like to include Dr. Collins' quote here. So a quote, he says, to those individuals in the biomedical research enterprise who have endured disadvantages due to structural racism, I am truly sorry. NIH is committed to instituting new ways to support diversity, equity, and inclusion, and identifying and dismantling any policies and practices that may harm our workforce and our science, end quote. And that's from March last year. So here are some of the steps that we are taking. And if you don't know about Unite, I would definitely refer to the website. Take a look at the website. We can certainly talk about that more in the question and answer session if you like. But as I round out this last section here, I want to talk about the ways that we have addressed women and gender diversity and the push for inclusive excellence. So we're following these 5 categories. So the first one I want to mention is action-oriented accountability. Taking a strong stand against sexual harassment, including gender harassment, and bullying through action-oriented accountability. We have new reporting pathways, anonymous reporting pathways, and for NIH, we have new responsibilities for any of us who are supervisors to report, even if it's not happening to you, or if you are aware of it or witness it, we have reporting requirements. And we have anonymous mechanisms that are less circuitous than they were in the past. We have expectations that NIH funding comes with your assurance that you're going to create a safe environment as an explicit condition of awards, and are encouraging universities, institutions to establish codes of conduct at NIH-sponsored conferences. So now a conference is a space that we're contributing to, so we expect to see codes of conduct there. In terms of demonstrable leadership support, Dr. Collins about 2 years ago said that he wouldn't speak on panels that weren't diverse. And he said, no more manels. Actually, this tweet was one of his most popular and most retweeted social media posts of all of his posts. And he called on all the institute and center directors to do the same. And he said to look at the diversity broadly. He specifically called out gender diversity, but he said he was also looking at racial and ethnic diversity. And he developed a new process for vetting his meeting invitations, so that is speaking invitations. He also established NIH Equity Committee for intramural. So that committee performs, hi, Monica, that's great to see that you're in the audience. That group performs equity assessments. And I'm telling you, those equity assessments are pretty rough. Like, how many square feet, how many offers of more money, who has more fellows, what level are the fellows, how many meetings did these people go to, what did they ask for that they didn't get? I mean, it's pretty intense. Establish the working group on women in biomedical careers, as was mentioned before. So we have a working group co-chaired by the NIH director, so the highest level of leadership, and he created the Chief Officer for Scientific Workforce Diversity, who was formerly Dr. Hannah Valentine and is now Dr. Marie Bernard. So in terms of promoting a culture of inclusion, some examples are the Unite initiative I mentioned, enhancing recruitment of senior tenured scientists from diverse backgrounds. Here we're talking intramural, so that's a work in progress. And then the cohort hiring and support they have. So NIH Intramural has a Distinguished Scholars Program. I'll show you a slide about that in the future. It covers both clinical and basic scientists, but it specifically addresses diversity. Enhanced flexibility options is another category. I've already mentioned reentry and reintegration, but let me tell you about the continuity supplements. I think I might have taken that slide out. So the continuity supplements are supplements that are available to first-time RPG recipients and K awardees. Because we know that transition from K to R is one of the biggest places where women leave the workplace, and that first renewal or second independent award. We provide additional funding available for people who have experienced a qualifying life event. That could be illness in a first-degree relative, could be childbirth, it could be adoption. There are a variety of qualifying life events that meet the criteria. And so we provide funding for the research to continue. So that's why I call them continuity supplements. And those have been in place for a couple of years now. I'm looking forward to some of the data. My group is getting the first level of data just for the routine program management. It's going to take a couple of years for us to see how this works, but every institute and center is working with us on this. So it's not an ORWH only program, it's an NIH program that we helped create through the working group on women in biomedical careers. We talked about a little bit before about kind of how stop the clock might not be so helpful, but it is a part of a flexibility option. And then a couple of years ago, R13 applications required applicants to list if there are family care provisions available at the locality of the conference. It's not required that they be there, but if they are there, it should be described. And so these are some of the steps that we've taken to be able to make it clear that expectations are in place for providing that so that as many people can participate as possible. Pre-COVID, pre-virtual meeting, but important still. And then we funded the RFA that I mentioned, the Causal Factors and Interventions RFA. There's a new RFA that NIGMS has out. Well, it's not a new RFA, it's an RFA that they've had for some time on interventions to advance people in science careers. But we wrote a notice of special interest to that FOA so that we specifically said that you could apply for funds to address sexual harassment in that NOCI. First time NIH has ever put that forward to say, here's a way to study interventions for this problem. I mean, we don't need to study the problem anymore because we know it's a problem. We want to study interventions to address the problem. We'll continue to study the problem, but we really are interested in interventions. And then Advancing Gender Inclusive Excellence, or AGGI, is a coordinating center. We have a FOA out on the street now. It's a coordinating center to study barriers to gender equity strategies to advance women. And the intention is to create this coordinating center first, and then have FOAs that will be from the ICs that will link to that coordinating center so that we can do smaller studies across the board in different scientific disciplines. The challenge prize I mentioned already. And here are two more details. So the first is the NRSA fellows. We're now providing $2,500 per budget period to support childcare costs. We know that doesn't meet all the childcare costs, but this was an important and meaningful and substantial step forward through all the requirements that we need to go through to make this happen. And I certainly hope that we continue to work on this area. And then of course there are the conference grants now have to include a diversity plan. So the diversity plan talks about how you are going to ensure diversity in the planning and the execution of your conference, and also speaks to providing us with information about the expertise of the individuals, the key personnel on your R13 application in terms of their record of performance in enhancing diversity. So it's not just, we're going to advertise this at an HBCU. It is, what are the people that are putting this conference on? What are their qualifications in terms of maximizing participation? And diversity here includes gender diversity. And the diversity statement of NIH includes gender diversity. It's not just racial and ethnic diversity. The statement was updated about a year ago, and it also includes socioeconomic status. So here are some of the other flexibility options and extensions that were put in place for early career scientists whose career trajectories have been significantly affected by COVID-19. No cost extensions. Cost extensions were for some ICs, institutes and centers were implemented. And really there are so many of these available, but they differ by IC. And I know that can be challenging for folks to navigate. Here's the continuity supplements, and it highlights the fact that the proportion of women in each of these career stages, which is in the dark blue, how it decreases over time, and how these specific transition points are places where women leave the workforce, the STEM research workforce. And that's why we try to bolster those two transition points with these continuity supplements to support women through these critical life events, when they're converting from a K to a first-time RPG. There are a lot of K awards, and so here's just a few of them. So I encourage you, if you're interested and to know more, to take a look at these. And I want to share something new. This is Dr. Marie Bernard, the new Chief Officer for Scientific Workforce Diversity. She's established an administrative supplement that's on the street now. Applications are due by April 7th to recognize excellence in diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility mentorship. So in addition to advocating for mentorship, we want to recognize that excellence. So it'll supplement existing awards of scientists who have demonstrated a commitment to exceptional training and mentorship up to $250,000 of direct costs, recognizing the crucial role that these mentors play in fostering future leaders of the enterprise. And then the second is their diversity supplements, which you probably know about, but I wanted to make sure that you were aware that women who are underrepresented in virtually every discipline at the most senior levels and even mid-career are eligible for diversity supplements on the basis of that underrepresentation. And so if you haven't looked at that lately, the language has been expanded, so please do check it out. And that's another very robust way to provide support. NIGMS created their Mosaic program, maximizing opportunities for scientific and academic independent careers, designed to facilitate the transition of promising postdocs from diverse backgrounds into those independent positions. It funds up to 2 years of a mentored postdoc career development award and up to 3 years of an independent award and a K99R00. And so it has two components. The program has an institutional focus component and then this postdoc component. And scholars are part of an organized scientific cohort. So there's a cohort around these individuals, and they participate in mentoring, networking, and professional development coordinated by the UE5 grantees. So Mosaic is another program that's out if you haven't heard about that one. This is the NIH Intramural Program. So there's the Lasker Award, which is for clinical research, and the Stadman tenure track investigators, who are for basic scientists. And these are both designed to grow the diminishing pool of talented researchers from diverse backgrounds. Individuals with a particular interest in diversity are certainly encouraged to apply, and diverse individuals are as well. And so there's more details here, but one's primarily clinical. And the Stadman even specifically calls out investigators with a history of mentoring and outreach activities to be funded here. So as I wrap this up, and these are my last 5 slides here, I'm going to highlight some examples of ORWH resources available to you. So we do try to publish and get the word out in the public domain about our intentions. And that was our paper, my paper with Francis, where we talked about our intention to develop policy programs and processes to address sex as a biological variable. We make our content available through videocast, so you can look at it later. Here's our online course, Bench to Bedside. As I mentioned, that's a collaboration with the FDA's Office of Women's Health. Our web content, which has been recently redesigned, our newsletter and our quarterly publication. So we have a monthly newsletter called The Pulse and a quarterly publication called In Focus. They cover slightly different topics, so please subscribe to each. And, for example, in our quarterly publication, we do scientist spotlights. We spotlight institutions who are doing amazing things. both scientifically and to advance women in STEM. And we review efforts that that our colleagues have supported in the 27 institutes and centers, and review papers as well. So in terms of where we need to go, we are committed to achieving equity and inclusion, and we are part of a huge ecosystem, and we can't do it alone. We have an important role to play, but we can't do it alone. And we believe that these collective strategies that I presented to you are important, and they represent positive progress, but continued effort is needed to achieve a culture of true equity and inclusion, where women scientists are not marginalized, diminished, or harassed in any professional setting or in the public eye. This redoubling of efforts that really needs to happen now is particularly important because of the disproportionate impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on women, which is continuing. And this will require continuous assessment of the environment, of policies and practices, as well as flexible, multi-pronged approaches to address inequities that we observe, like salary gaps, gender salary gaps, and obstacles as they are identified. It's not just the right thing to do, it's critical to our mission to achieve, turn discovery into health for everyone, to fund the best science. And we know that a diverse workforce produces better science and more innovation. It's not debatable. And as a public funder of biomedical research, we are taxpayers' duty to ensure full participation of women and underrepresented groups. And we're committed to achieving gender equity across the research enterprise and disrupting the environments and processes that serve as barriers to women and other marginalized groups. So the key to not losing women from science, they've made incredible contributions and will continue to do so, is through concerted, intentional efforts. And we can't do it alone. It requires system-wide and institution-wide solutions, creativity and accountability, and all of our health depends on our ability to do this together. So I am just so excited to be here and look forward to your questions and answers. Here's some of the ways to follow us on social media and connect with us. And I will go ahead and stop sharing so that we can at least look at each other. There you go, Sandy.
This was just spectacular. Thank you so much, Janine, not only for presenting it, but for everything you're doing at NIH. It's just glorious to see that whatever we want to do, there are openings there now, which I think is really growth that you've promoted. And you, Hannah Valentine, Francis Collins, Marie Bernard, what a team. So thank you. This has really been great. I wanted to also tell you that we've recently gotten a first award, and we are working.
Congratulations!
Isn't that wonderful? So again, and diversity and a cohort, and so there. Let me ask you the first question that's in the chat, and then we'll ask for others. So Victoria Roth asks, are there efforts at the NIH to specifically support the work of transgender women and non-binary individuals, and/or work that serves these populations?
Sure, great question. Thanks, Victoria. So let me answer the second part first. So there is work, NIH is supporting efforts, in particular, using the term that we use at NIH, sexual gender minority research, which encompasses these groups. And so there is specific research funding for that. There is a sexual gender minority research office that was established several years ago. They created an administrative supplement program, actually patterned after our administrative supplement program, and we've been working with them to grow that program, and we've supported that research ourselves, as well as multiple institute centers and offices. Dr. Karen Parker is the director of that institute, and she is developing a variety of pathways to, as in the first part of your question, identify ways to support the work of transgender scientists specifically. So I know she has started a workshop series. I don't know more of the details on that, but I'd be happy to get more details and share it with Sandy, and so they can get to the group. Great question.
Yeah. And just wanted to point out that we did record this session so that all of this amazing wealth of opportunities that the NIH provides will be there for people to go back and look at. And I think that could really make a difference. I have a question that I think I approached you with probably about 10 years ago, Janine, as I followed you into a ladies' room for a close-up talk. The question, you've pointed out the K to R transition and how important that is. One of the other really critical transitions is the renewal of that first R01, because that's often the point at which they're almost ready to come up for associate professor. They usually have a family with one or two little ones. Are any of these opportunities specific? Could they be used for people, the continuity, for example, support?
Great. Oh, Sandy, great. You set me up very well. So one of the continuity supplements is specifically for first RPG renewals. So absolutely that exact spot, whether it's either, you're going for a renewal or you're writing your second independent application.
Terrific.
Because you're so right. It's, the age at first R01 has increased, so we know the biological clock is all along there, and many of us delay that, and it's very challenging for anybody to navigate that. So we wanted to provide those two K to R and first RPG renewal or second independent award as specific places to provide support.
Thank you. You've really, I can't believe how much has grown over this time. So let's see, there's another question here. Curious to know if you can share early insights on data on interventions that work. Secondly, once you answer that one, quick question. I think I didn't catch which newsletter we can subscribe to besides the ORWH one.
Okay, so data on interventions that work. Some of those were summarized by, blocking on her name right now. And so that is in the public domain. The research partnership is the group. And they took those 14 grantees from our causal factors RFA. They got together because we had several meetings. So the best place to go is, I can refer you to the ORWH website where we have a report of that meeting. And that's where they presented their findings. So that's a good place to start. The careers section of our website, which is nih.gov/women. And then they were published in a special issue. There was a paper published in a special issue of Academic Medicine that summarized that and put them in this kind of framework of individual approaches, inter-individual approaches, and institutional approaches. So yes, those are available. Things like training of mentors, not the training of the mentee, training of the mentor. Steps like assessing climate with validated questionnaires and not saying, oh, culture, climate, we can't measure that, because that's not true. Culture and climate can be measured. Doing assessments of your institution, a la Sea Change or Athena Swan, the approach where institution says, let's measure ourselves, this is where we are, and then let's pick something we're going to work on, and let's follow the data over time, right? Recognizing, I know that's challenging, there are issues there, but those approaches are some of the approaches. Some of the things that are less well known are things like, these are not from the causal factors interventions, but I'll just share this with you, belongingness interventions, where things happen so that people can identify themselves as science as part of their identity, as a science identity. So there's quite a bit of work there, but if you start with our website, I think you'll find enough places that can get you to a bit more scholarly work. So there are two ORWH newsletters. One's called The Pulse, and it's monthly by email. Our second one is a quarterly publication called Women's Health in Focus, and that's you can subscribe to all of these from our website. So I'll put the link in the chat in a minute when I get a chance, but they're available pretty broadly.
Terrific. Are there any other questions right now? I think there's so much to chew on here. So if Oh, good. You put in the
Yeah,
chat.
let me put those two in the chat. So that's the quarterly, that's the monthly. And if you want to hear about our events, I didn't get to talk about, diverse voices. We have a diverse voices webinar where we're talking about all kinds of issues, things like the effect of housing on health, the effect of incarceration on health, COVID and diverse women. So I put our events chat, our link in there, and also the, I hope those work, the e-learnings information. So, but all of it's available on our website. I do want to just say, Sandy, I really commend you at Mount Sinai for the work that you all are doing, because you have brought attention to this. And when we met, I mean, I think the first question you asked me was about Fuchs dystrophy and whether there were sex differences in Fuchs dystrophy. I mean, that was maybe in the bathroom. So
Right.
this
Yep.
is an ophthalmology question. And
Right.
so just to end up with, it really was these sex differences in eye disease that shifted my focus. I still see patients a little bit, a couple days a month, but the fact that there were 2/3 of the world's blind are women, and we couldn't explain that by the fact that women live longer than men, that I had not been taught that in ophthalmology residency, that nobody used the word sex and gender, it was just like amazing to me. It just was like, there's clearly so much work needs to be done in this space. And so I feel really privileged to have had the opportunity to have this impact in a different way. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, this has just been a joy. And I will tell you, you could spend hours on the ORWH website because there are so many resources. There are toolkits there. There are links to many other places. It's beautifully done. So do take advantage of it. And so now Devin, if you put up the other slides, I'm going to do a couple of commercials to end this. But before I do that, I just want to say again how incredible it was to have you here, to hear everything you're doing, and in any way we can help, we would love to, because you're really helping us. It's just wonderful. Thank
My
you.
pleasure. My pleasure.
Yeah, so now our little commercials here for those of you who have another 2 minutes. I wanted to feature what you've probably seen in emails, the approach that we're using, Building Gender Equity Together, which are facilitated dialogue sessions where members of the school are getting together, and these are students, trainees, faculty, and staff. You'll be invited to participate in conversations to develop some additional powerful community-led solutions that we can implement together with the administration for improving gender equity across the school. So please sign up for this. It'll be in each case, it's a 90-minute think tank, like brainstorming session that's facilitated by a trained member of our community. And you can see the QR code here. And as a token of gratitude, each participant receives a gift certificate for a snack. Talking about snacks, Just Desserts is the next thing I want to feature. Many of you have been attending these either in person when we did serve desserts or by Zoom. And what it is a monthly opportunity for an informal meeting for everybody, all our staff, trainees, and faculty. And we feature a single outstanding woman physician or scientist. And it is essentially behind a closed door, and that it provides you with a chance to hear how a successful path in science or medicine is charted by a woman today, and also to ask those questions about career and life and the other things you can't get answered in a formal presentation. The next one is next Wednesday, March the 2nd, with Rachel Yehuda, who's a professor of psychiatry and neuroscience. And finally, I'd like to ask you all to stay connected with us. Follow us on Twitter, sign up for the quarterly newsletter, check out our website, and share your suggestions with us. We really care. The only way we're going to be able to do the things that we all want to do is to do them together. So please join us, and we'll see you again, hopefully at Just Desserts and then our next Amplifying Equity seminar. And I can't thank again Dr. Janine Clayton for the wonderful work you're doing and for the wonderful presentation. Thanks again.
Thank you.